Just very briefly, one of the questions that's always asked is, well, okay, weak health structures, suspicion of government. Well, these are all characteristics of previous outbreaks. So what's changed? What made this one different? And I think that there is an important answer to that. And I think what's made this one different has to do with broader regional and global changes that have to do with the movement of populations, with increasing mobility, with better communications. What we're seeing is a local manifestation of globalization. People are moving more often, they're moving farther, they're moving more quickly. And complicating this is a rural to urban migration. If any of you have read Kilcullen's book, Out of the Mountains, he's described this phenomenon of this accelerating rural to urban migration that is overwhelming the ability of large municipalities to provide municipal services, to provide health care, to provide infrastructure, to provide policing. What's happening in Africa is these peripheries are growing up around the core of capitals and large cities. Excuse me. And these are vast swaths of shanty towns that have no water, no electricity, no real health facilities, poor education, limited, very, very limited to non-existent police services. The local police just won't go in there because it's too dangerous. It exceeds their ability to operate. And so this is creating circumstances that are really ideal for the spread of this kind of disease. And I think what we're seeing in West Africa today, and I agree with Teresa, I think you're absolutely right. This is not something that's going to go away, even after this outbreak is ultimately brought under control. This is a characterization. This is a characteristic of the new global system. The ability for problems like this to be isolated and to remain in a single area. That time is gone. Which brings us to one of Teresa's most important recommendations, the need to build resilience and build sustainable health infrastructure. This is not the first time we're going to see this. The next time may be Ebola, may not be Ebola, it may be something else. But the dynamic that contributed to the rapid spread of the disease and the continuation of the outbreak, those are characteristics that are increasingly characterizing the global system as a whole. So this is something that we really need to address. And a lot of you are going to be involved in answering these questions. So just to talk briefly about the response and where we are right now. Well, a couple months ago, we passed the point where, okay, yeah, it's a problem. Now we're kind of at the point of, wow, it's a big problem. But we haven't really gotten past the, wow, it's a big problem, to the point of moving the kind of material, people, supplies, and capabilities that are going to be necessary to roll back the disease. And I'm not referring as much to the health workers, to the doctors, to the nurses, as I am to the massive logistics effort that is going to be necessary to extend the kind of healthcare response Teresa has described to every hamlet and village in those three countries. Because if you don't do that, even if you control the outbreak in Monrovia, you're simply going to get a new wave of infections. So this is the challenge that we're looking at. And keep in mind, every time I deal with a victim, I need gloves, mask, goggles, gown, and as soon as I'm done, they have to be destroyed. And the next time I go back to dealing with that victim, whether it's in an isolation ward or is much more often the case right now in West Africa, it's my son, it's my daughter, it's my husband, and I'm caring for him as best I can. Every time I do that, I need a new set of protective clothing, every time. And I have to know, it's not just having it. I have to know how to put it on and how to take it off correctly. Because if I make one mistake, then I'm infected. And this is the challenge. Now, in practical terms, we're all military folks. What does this mean? In Liberia and Sierra Leone and probably Guinea, it means you need to put a box full of masks, gloves, gowns, and goggles in every inhabited structure in that country. Every one. And you need to replace it routinely until the outbreak is controlled. think about that. Think about the tonnages we're talking about. The throughput it's going to require at the seaports and the airheads. The transportation that's going to be necessary to move this stuff. Not talking the doctors, nurses, health workers. We're talking the stuff they need. Imagine trying to treat one of these infections or trying to dispose of one of the bodies in a place where I don't have electricity, I don't have any clean water, I don't have any food, I don't have any transportation, I don't have any lights. And that describes a substantial part of all three of these countries. So this is the challenge that we confront right now. We're talking about a humanitarian disaster on the scale of Haiti. Don't be deceived by the numbers of folks that are on the sort of the dead and dying list right now. When we're talking about 1.4 million, and keep in mind, that's just Ebola. Okay? That's not malaria. That's not the consequences of no more food, no more water, because the structures have completely broken down. That's not the consequences of the collapse of stability. I mean, in a real sense, we're kind of talking World War Z here in that localized area where the outbreak is worst. So what does this mean for us as military folks? In all likelihood, the ability of the health community to respond to this on the scale that's necessary was exceeded a while ago. The doctors and nurses that are on the front lines of fighting this disease right now are going to require a massive logistics effort to support their operations. You're going to have to establish all of the things that you need to confront these illnesses, to deal with those unfortunates who succumb to the disease in ways that don't perpetuate the infection, which means the bodies have to be collected, they have to be properly disposed of, and all that needs to happen with people who are in full protective gear and who understand viscerally how to avoid becoming infected themselves. So, I mean, I'd like to be encouraging about this, but the decision by President Obama to send military forces, that's a critical watershed. Major General Williams, many of you know him, that's the U.S. Army Africa commander. He's on the ground in Monrovia right now. Trust me, he's going to look around. He's going to figure out what's necessary. Once he does that, he's going to have to mobilize AFRICOM, the Joint Staff, and OSD to begin making that stuff happen. All of this is going to impact on all of you. It's going to take a while, even with immediate response. To move this kind of stuff is going to take a while. So it's going to be a while before we can really get the response to the outbreak moving on the scale that's necessary. Anything any of you as individuals can do to contribute to this in your own personal way or through the institutions that you work in is critically, critically important. And that certainly goes for my European colleagues. The U.S. military doesn't have the stuff to do this. We can certainly help, but we are going to need other nations to weigh in with direct military assistance, and we're going to need a lot of capabilities on the ground, not just from the military side. This requires a unified response from the military, from the private sector, guys like Pacific Architects and Engineering and Halliburton, from the NGO community, the humanitarian assistance community that provide expertise like Teresa's on the ground in the countries where the outbreak is occurring. So I encourage you to find ways to contribute to helping move a response forward, because it is desperately needed, and the longer we wait, the worse it's going to get, the longer it's going to last, the greater the impact is going to be. And I personally suspect that the impact is going to be well beyond those three countries. I'll be very, very surprised if we don't see major outbreaks, at a minimum in Mali and Cote d'Ivoire, and I suspect we're going to see outbreaks in other countries around the continent, and eventually we're going to see cases outside of Africa. Having said that, the last thing I want to say is we really need to focus on the last point Teresa made. What should come both now and afterwards? Lessons learned. We need to be learning the lessons of this right now. The conclusion that is inescapable is that the response to this was bungled by the international community. It was bungled by everybody. We can't afford these kind of mistakes. We have to figure out how to deal with that next outbreak so we don't end up where we are right now. We need we really need to recognize that this kind of public health threat needs to feature in our national security thinking. We need to understand that it is a threat to our vital national interests. It is a threat to the vital national interests of every one of our partners on the continent. And we need to address in realistic terms how we need to change the playing field in the global community to minimize the risk of this happening again. We have a vested interest in building the kind of resilience and sustainable health infrastructure in places like rural Liberia and Gekidu, Guinea, every bit as immediate as the vital interests of those countries where the outbreak's occurring. This is affecting us right now. It's affecting us economically. It's going to affect us politically. Eventually, we're probably going to see some more cases. We've got to recognize this. When we have a national security, and I go back and look at the national security strategy, the last one that was done by the current administration. Take a look at maybe the last 3 or 4. Look for the public health content. Look for the content that addresses the issue of pandemic disease as a potential national security threat. We've got to take this more seriously. Everybody does.